Welcome to Next Gen VC, a podcast from Gen Zs to Gen Zs. We aim to be the transparent window into the mysterious world of VCs and startups through authentic conversations with the very individuals that make them. Today, we're speaking to Danielle, Managing Director and Partner at BCG Digital Ventures. Previously, she was an operating partner at PICO Partners, a leading early-stage venture capital fund headquartered in Israel. Danielle also held roles at Bain, Benchmark Capital, and Morgan Stanley in both New York and Tel Aviv. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the follow button and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram at NextGenVCPod for updates on the latest episodes.
Danielle, we're so excited to have you on our podcast. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
We'd love to start by hearing a bit about your story. What was life before DV like, and what made you decide to move from Tel Aviv to London?
Sure. So I started in a very typical career path. I spent time at Morgan Stanley. I went to business school. I joined Bain after business school. But my husband was transferred to Tel Aviv back in the early 2000s. And so I went with him and I realized one does not move to Tel Aviv to be a management consultant. There's just too much going on in the world of startups and tech. And that's where I really began my startup journey. And so I went to a fund called Benchmark Capital and I spent time there. And from there, it really kind of took off. And I spent most of my career jumping back and forth between operator and investor roles, both with Benchmark and some of their follow-on funds, because each of the partners from Benchmark went off and started their own fund. And so I love deploying capital, but I really love rolling up my sleeves as an operator. And I've worked across the portfolio in a variety of roles. And then my husband actually was transferred again, and that's what brought us to London several years ago.
That's amazing, Danielle. And I wanted to touch a little bit more on Tel Aviv. Israel is such a small country, but there's so much going on in the startup ecosystem. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you think that is possible?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of reasons. And I mean, it's startup nation, right? There's many books on this topic written by people who have grown up there. And I was an expat. But I can give my perspective. I think there's a few things. One is it's a relatively new country. So the country is a startup and there's just this mentality of let's do it. So I think that's just part of the cultural DNA. But there's something else, and that something else is mandatory military service. So after people finish high school, everyone goes into the military, and there are some very elite units where you're exposed to best-in-class technology. And so you have a lot of people coming out of the Army going to university and they have that entrepreneurial bug because they've been exposed to some pretty cool tech that then they're trying to think about how to leverage, how to build on top of, and how to create a new company and a breakout. And because there's been so many unicorns there and so many successful startups, it's kind of in people's mentality of, well, I'm doing one. And if that one doesn't get funded, I have 3 others in my back pocket. Anytime I met with an entrepreneur, if we didn't get that excited about one, they said, oh, well, I'm working with my cousin on this other one. And it's just, everyone's got a startup and they're dabbling in other startups because they've seen the success. And in the US market, it's quite common to do your university degree or do your graduate degree and then join a corporate. And that's what people do. There's a tremendous amount of debt. You have to pay it back. But I don't think that's the mentality in Israel. Most people don't, have these dreams of joining big corporates. The dream is of doing that startup. There's also probably less debt. So you're less beholden to pay it off. To be quite frank, healthcare is free. So it's quite different than the US market. And so you can take a bit more of that risk and no one looks down on you for taking that risk. I think they admire you for taking that risk. So I think it's the variety of the military service. You have less of the handcuffs to pay off the debt. Entrepreneurs are admired. There's much more of that risk-taking culture. And I think all of that kind of combines to set the tone for this startup nation.
That definitely sounds really interesting, and there definitely seems to be a very big entrepreneurial culture coming out of Israel. But what was it like moving from Tel Aviv to London and the culture of working in Israel and then in London? Could you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that because I think my first massive culture shock was actually New York to Tel Aviv, because that really hit me hard because, again, I hadn't worked in a startup before. I hadn't worked in venture. It was quite different than being at Bain and having clients, and everything had to be fully polished. And, in startup world, you just want to get something out the door. You want to get that pilot in market. You want to get some users. And so that was actually a massive shock to my system. I was used to spending all night making a slide perfect. There's no slides in startup world. You need code, and you need a product, and you need to look at your metrics. And so moving from Tel Aviv to London was actually what I would call a soft landing, because I had, come from a market where I spoke the language. And so the shift from Tel Aviv to London was actually much easier on me and my family, by the way, the New York to Tel Aviv move at that time.
Speaking of the culture shock between corporate and startups, I think digital ventures is a very interesting mesh between the two. Could you tell us a little bit more about what digital ventures actually is?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about digital ventures. And those of us that work here, we call it DV. So you'll hear me refer to it as DV today. So digital ventures is a business unit of BCG. And you can think of us as a startup in a box. And what we do is we come up with ideas, we build them, and we launch them with corporate partners. So there's always a corporate partner as our sponsor, and they work with us on the idea. And I can tell you why that is, but they bring a lot of benefits to the table, like their capital and like their access to the market. And so we work with them to come up with breakthrough business ideas. And we've been at this for 8 years now, and we're really proud of our track record of having launched about 190 businesses and products into the market globally.
What's the difference between that and a CVC or corporate venture capital?
A CVC is deploying capital into things that, what I would say, off the street. So someone's going to come to them, and it might be strategic for that corporate to deploy capital because maybe they want to bring that company in-house, or maybe there's a reason they're going to use that product and they want some skin in the game on the upside. Digital ventures, we don't write checks for deals off the street. So I don't spend my day meeting with different entrepreneurs like I used to do in a prior life and deciding, what's my investment thesis and what bets am I going to make and how am I going to help those entrepreneurs. Digital ventures comes up with the ideas and works with our corporate partners to build them. We do sometimes take equity in what we build, or if it's going to become a new business unit, we may do different types of financial upside, alternative fee arrangements, and taking some upside if certain milestones and KPIs are going to be hit, because there's not necessarily going to be a liquidity event if it's a new business unit. But I think the biggest difference between digital ventures and a VC or a CVC is that we are not funding external deals. We are working on deals that we build in-house.
And that definitely sounds like a unique model, which most companies don't have. And on that, what kind of roles does DV have? What kind of work do people get up to? Could you tell us a bit more about kind of, the structure of what's available for someone who might want to join DV?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I love talking about the diverse folks that we have walking the halls at DV, and it's actually one of the reasons that brought me to the firm. So when we talk about the roles at DV, we always talk about cohorts. And when you join DV, you join into a cohort. And the best way to think about it is really, what are the roles that any startup would have? And so, because those are the type of people that we would need to deploy. And we really pride ourselves on these multidisciplinary teams, because that's what it takes to build a business, all these different skill sets. So some of the cohorts that we have at Digital Ventures are product. So these are the people who are thinking about the roadmap and how we're actually going to build this. We have a whole engineering team. So this is your front end and your back end and data science. We have a whole design cohort. So this is your UI and UX, but also strategic designers, people who can go into the field and do ethnographic research with users and customers and make sure that this product is indeed going to solve their pain. We have venture architects, and these are people you can think of as the business people on the team. So they're going to help figure out the go-to-market and the pricing and the business plan and how we're going to raise capital. We have a whole growth squad. So these are people who are doing user acquisition and figuring out acquisition costs of different users in different markets. We have a talent team, because anytime we build these businesses, we often have to recruit leadership in and think about how we're going to compensate them and equity models. And so These are just some of the examples of the different cohorts we have at TV. And depending on what stage the product is at, we might ramp up and ramp down different teams, as you'd imagine. Day one, when we don't even know what we're building, we don't need a team of 15 engineers. But once we get into alpha, you might need that team, and you might need double that team depending on the complexity of the business you're trying to build.
And we're wondering, what does the application look like? Does it differ between the different roles as well?
There's differences in terms of the questions you're asked, but I would say the application is looking for a couple things. So one is certainly fit interviews. So do you have that growth mindset? Are you going to fit in to our culture and our business where you have to work with other DVers? We work hand in hand with our colleagues from BCG who really know the different sectors. So these are people who spent their life in financial services or energy or consumer. And there's other areas within BCG that we collaborate as well. And they have to also, of course, get along with clients. We are in the client business. So there's all of that. But then there's the competencies. So these are case studies, but very specific to the role that someone would be playing on the team. So if you're an engineer, you might have to do an engineering exercise. Or if you're a business person, we might give you, a standard business case and walk us through, how you'd build the business plan for this business. So it's interesting in that everyone who joins DV might follow a different interview process depending on the cohort that they're applying for. We also, of course, have non-venture facing staff. So there's a lot of people behind the scenes who make our firm work. So this is everything from finance to marketing to operations, administrative, and of course, their interview process is slightly different, but I would be doing a disservice if I left out that side of the business because we are a business and there's a lot of people who help us do what we do.
And it definitely sounds like there's a lot that's been going on in the past few years. Would you be able to share with us your favorite company that you've built or a success story from DV?
So a lot of our success stories are difficult to talk about, one, because of confidentiality, and two, because it might not be something that's market-facing or B2C. So it might be something that we've created and becomes a business unit of a company that you're familiar with. But one that we love to talk about, especially because it was built in the London market, was something that we did with SGN. So they're a gas company, and all utilities are under pressure to maintain very high productivity and keep prices low. And one of the challenges we observed was that you had field workers who are going out in the field and they're doing a lot of forms by hand, and there's a lot of repetition in those forms. And we thought, how can we reimagine that whole journey? And how can we digitize it? And so we created an app that enables someone who's going out into the field to do a risk assessment of a job site, and it improves overall job safety, and it allows collaboration between someone who's in a field crew and their remote managers. And it also ensures that there's good quality data that's linked back to what happened at the job site, and overall safety improves. And in building this solution, we realized that it wasn't only applicable for the field workers for SGN, but they can create an entire business around this and sell this to any utility or any oil and gas company that has people out in the field. So you can think of lots of different applications for people who are going into the field and they need to do a very rapid site assessment of a job to understand what dangers may be lurking. And so not only do they use this at the company for whom we created it and built it together, but they also created a new company. And that new company has been wildly successful. So a few things that we can report publicly is they recently raised $10 million in their Series A. They also recently won the HS2 Innovator Accelerator Award. And when we built it and launched it, they also were recognized as the Emerging Technology of the Year from the UK IT Industry Awards. So this is one we're very proud of and as having significant impact in the market.
That's amazing, Danielle. And I think I worked on a DV project a couple months ago, and that was what blew me away. You had so much resource to create a startup. And like you said, the leverage that these big companies have really makes your position as a startup interesting. But on the flip side, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges faced by DV?
This is a good question because, these challenges change depending on the bigger macroeconomic climate. So, there was the backdrop of COVID and the backdrop of everything with Ukraine. So I think there's some challenges faced by DV that are faced by a lot of folks these days. So for instance, talent. everyone is competing for the best in class talent out there. And what can we do to make our value prop more compelling and get people to join us instead of a startup, instead of big tech, instead of a venture fund? And so, everyone has this problem, but I think our value prop is indeed compelling in terms of the experience and the exposure that people get when they join DV. So that's something that everyone has. And another thing on my mind is ventures that have impact. So we've always focused on ventures that have impact, financial impact for the business, strategic impact for our corporate partners. But we've recently launched Green Ventures. And Green Ventures is about climate impact. So, how do we as a firm do our part to help accelerate the energy transition and really work on ventures that have financial upside, but of course also environmental upside, and work with our corporate partners to force them to launch new businesses that are going to help accelerate this. So I think this is a burden, again, not just on DV, but on all of us who have a role to play in helping the climate transition.
That's definitely really exciting. And, you see a lot of venture funds popping up in the climate tech space too. And it's something a lot of younger people think about where they want to start their careers and where they're going to have an impact. And on that, I wanted to ask you, for someone who might be considering different options, maybe joining big tech or venture or a venture builder or DV, how would you go about making that decision? And why would you tell them to join DV over everything else?
This is a good question. And I meet candidates all the time who are, trying to think through that. And I always say to them, one, do you like the people you've met here? Because no matter where you go, you're going to be spending a lot of time there. And just the most important consideration is the people that you will be working with and the opportunities you'll have. But then the next question is really, what do you want to do, with your career? And it's hard to say, what do you want to do in the next 20 years, but what do you want to do in the next 3 to 5 to 10? Because if you want to eventually have a startup, I would say, get some of those building blocks, get them now, learn all of the different disciplines of building that startup, the business side, the product side, the technology side, because all individuals have some spike. But it's important to have balance. So you might be the greatest CPO product person, but you really need to understand the business side as well. You really need to understand, how your startup is going to raise capital or what the business model is. And so I think if you just want to see a lot and build that toolkit, DV is a fantastic place. If you go to a startup, you may have more responsibility, and that's great, but you also may not be learning, the best in class way to do something. So these are things, I thought about as well in my career. Where could I go that's going to give me, this amazing toolkit that will then help me with the next thing? And that's how I made some of the decisions I made early in my career. The one thing that I really do like about DV is even if there is a junior person on the team, because they're in, a specific project of building a venture to launch the health insurance for Qantas, or building a venture to do a different product or service, it's a pretty lean team. So there's a tremendous amount of responsibility, even for junior people in our organization. So they still might be the CTO of this new business that we're building, or they might be the general manager, or and so that's also something I would encourage people to think about. Where are you going? Who are the people that are going to be there? What's the role that you're going to have in the team? And are you going to have a lot of bureaucratic burdens on you, or are you really going to get to shine? And one of the things I like about DV is I do think we empower our people to take on a lot of responsibility.
That's amazing, Danielle. And you yourself had quite a diverse career as well before you joined DV. Is there anything about venture capital at all that you missed today?
Oh, I loved working with the entrepreneurs. Yeah, I do miss it because, like I said earlier in our chat, I don't get to meet entrepreneurs all day long who are just so passionate about what they're doing, and they will, make it work at all costs, and they will bring in the right talent. So I miss that. We are starting to work with much earlier stage companies at DV and helping them accelerate their path to market or help figure out, pricing models. But I don't see the volume of founders that I saw in my old world. And that gives you so much energy when you meet people all day who are just so committed. So I do miss that a bit. I don't want to say it's easier to be the one writing the check than the one building the business, so sitting on one side of the table, but you do have a little more control of your day when you're the venture capitalist versus when, at DV, I have clients. If they want to speak, we've got to make ourselves available. So the way you spend your time and the amount of control you have over your time is always going to be a little bit different when you have clients. And so that was a bit of a change for me as well, coming back to the services business versus being on the venture side of things. But both are really exciting. It really just depends what someone wants to do.
Do you think it makes more sense to go from VC and then DV or the other way around? Or do you think it doesn't really matter?
That's a good question. Being a VC is not a prerequisite to join digital ventures because remember, a lot of the folks that we have at digital ventures have a specific expertise like engineering or product, like some of the things that we've spoken about. It's definitely not a requirement that one rotates through a venture capital role to join us. One thing that I do think it's important to do before DV would consider an applicant is getting some experience. So we need people who can hit the ground running from day one. We don't have a program like our friends at BCG who hire an army of people out of university every year or after an advanced degree program and do a lot of training. We need people who can plug in, pretty quickly. Of course, we spend time onboarding and doing a bit of training. But one of our value propositions to our corporate partners is that we have someone who's done this. We have someone who's written code and been a product person or been a strategic designer in the real world. They didn't do it, day one in their career at DV. So something that is important when joining DV is a little bit of real world experience. And that experience could be very varied depending on the role that someone's coming to do in DV. But it's certainly not that one has to have done a VC role. I think that role is relevant for people who are joining one of our cohorts to understand what it takes to unlock capital or how venture capitalists think, but it's certainly not a prerequisite.
And on that, do you think because you're going straight into building these businesses and, your teams are full of people with incredible experience, do you think that the organization and the people that make up DV are a little older than, say, a traditional kind of corporate or a VC fund? And do you think that that puts off younger people from applying because they don't feel that they necessarily have the experience to get into a venture builder, or they need a couple more years working in something else?
Oh, goodness. I certainly hope people aren't discouraged at a young age. We need all capabilities. We need diversity across the board. And there are those roles. So we have, different entry points at DV. And so people do join us out of university or they do join us out of, after a couple of years. And the people who have joined us out of university have been doing many things on the side. So they might have had a startup while they were in university, or they might have been working their way through. So I wouldn't want anyone to be misled, like, oh, I've got to do a decade before I even send these folks my CV. That's certainly not the case. So there's different on-ramps for all levels. And I think it, again, depends what someone wants to do. A lot of people who join us do intend to do their own startup. And the reason they join us is because they want, to kind of drink from that fire hose and see a lot. They want to see different sectors and different problems and different stages. We work from the idea stage to the build stage. So they want to see that end to end, and then they leave. Sadly, we've had some folks leave recently who took other folks with them, but that's our model. So we should really celebrate that because I hope they all go on to become unicorns. Another interesting bit of our value prop is people join us, we launch a business, and then they go with that business. So they might go into the CEO role, or they might go into the head of sales or head of product or CTO. And that's part of our value prop as well. So I think, and by the way, some of those people then rejoin DV. We call them the boomerangs. So they joined DV, they went out, they did something in a business we launched, and then they come back. So I think, we're very flexible and open-minded, and we want to do what's right for our people and what's right for the business. So I think all models apply. I hope that answered the question, because I think there's no exact right time to join, and there's no exact right time to leave, and then there's no exact right time to rejoin. But we're open to all of it, and we have lots of examples of all of these situations.
That's amazing, Danielle. And before we move to the quick fire round, I wanted to ask a little bit more about where DV actually operates, because we know a lot of our listeners are not based in London. And I also know that DV is expanding massively across the globe. Can you tell us a little bit more about opportunities outside of London?
Absolutely. We are hiring across the board. So find me on LinkedIn and send over a CV. So we are about 1,000 people globally. We've got a pretty big footprint in the US market with some offices in Manhattan Beach in York. We're opening Chicago. We're opening Austin. And then in Europe, our biggest footprint is London and Berlin. We have a Paris office as well. We've recently announced some new office openings in the Middle East, in India. Of course, we have a good Asia footprint as well, everything from Singapore to Sydney to China. And so there's ample opportunities. And one of the other value props for our staff is they sometimes bounce between offices. So there's someone I used to work with out of Berlin, and now he's in California. There's people who rotate through London from other markets. And so again, flexibility is the name of the game here, but we're pretty aggressively hiring right now into a lot of global positions.
That's awesome, Danielle. Are you ready for the quickfire now?
I don't know, guys. I don't know.
Let's do it. So the first question, let's start with an easy one. Where is somewhere everyone must visit in Israel?
Oh, Tel Aviv. This is an easy one. Beach, restaurants. Oh, it's beautiful.
If you weren't at DV, what would you be doing? And you can't say VC.
Oh, I would be in an operating role. I love operating roles. So I'd probably go in and be a COO or CEO or head of a business unit in a growth stage company. So something that's, raised some capital, that has product market fit and now needs to scale. This is when I love to play.
Awesome. And you've lived across the world, Danielle. Where would you live if you could live in any city in the world?
Oh my goodness, were you at my dinner table last night? We have these questions all the time. This is such a hard challenge. So I really like warm weather and I like a beach. So if I could live anywhere in the world, it would be somewhere with a more mild climate and where I could wake up every day and look out my window and see beach. London is not the mild climate, and I haven't seen the beach from my window in London in a while.
Do you have any advice for someone who wants to get into venture building or start a career at DV?
I think just go do it somewhere. So there's a lot of people who are sitting in a corporate role or, talking about it. But the best thing to do is just try and figure out a way to do it. So that might be advising a startup in your spare time. It might, just kind of plugging in. There's so many different events, especially when we've all been virtual for 2 years, that you can kind of join some of the conferences, hear what's going on, go hear pitches at different demo days, help an accelerator. So you could either make the plunge and go join one of those things, or you can begin to dabble and do it on the side. And it'd be really hard to justify to someone why, you're making the switch if you're not able to talk to what's happening in the industry and all the interesting startups in an area that you care about. So it could be blockchain, it could be metaverse, it could be, pick something, but be conversant in that thing and be able to show your passion.
And is there any particular startup from Israel that you think is amazing and everyone needs to know about?
This is a tough question. So I'll pick one that I used to work for, and it's called Windward, and they do really interesting maritime analytics. Everything from, is this vessel fishing in illegal waters to helping military and defense. But now they're also doing a lot as it relates to climate. And so this is a really interesting startup with some very passionate founders. They've raised capital. And so I was proud to be affiliated with them for a few years when I was in Tel Aviv.
That's awesome. And last question, you mentioned about the different sort of vertical or industries that you can be part of. Is there any particular areas that you think are increasingly booming in DV and in the venture building space?
Sure. So I think there's some verticals that have always been very big for digital ventures. So this could be, consumer, or it could be healthcare. Where I spend a lot of my time is in energy. And wow, what a case for change there is right now in that sector for a lot of the legacy players to continue and transform their business. And then the slice that I'm very excited about that we spoke about a little earlier is our green ventures. And that program cuts across all sectors because everyone has this challenge. And so this is where I see a lot of our growth. In fact, in energy today, over half of our venture building are things related to climate. So it could be something from carbon tracking to methane emission tracking to EV charging to, hydrogen, you pick it. There's so many interesting topics there. And then climate just more broadly, circular economy trends, reducing packaging, decarb supply chain. So there's just so much opportunity. And these are critical because they're really going to help, enable net zero, et cetera.
That's definitely really exciting. And I love the passion and energy you've brought to this conversation. And it's really interesting to see the perspective from DV and the work you do and how it's not just traditional venture. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Danielle. It was wonderful chatting with you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Next Gen VC, a podcast from Gen Zs to Gen Zs. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the subscribe button and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram at Next Gen VC Pod for updates on the latest episodes.